We escaped, but his whispers still haunt us. Ceramics die Bach. The storm had been stalking them for hours, its relentless fury battering the cracked windshield of Claire Winslow's aging SUV. The rhythmic thrum of the wipers was hypnotic, barely holding back the onslaught of rain that smeared the view outside into shadowy blurs. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and forced herself to keep going. She stole a glance at Ethan, her teenage son, slouched in the passenger seat with earbuds jammed in his ears, his face bathed in the cold blue light of his phone. Behind them, Emily clutched her worn stuffed rabbit as if it were a lifeline, her wide, solemn eyes fixed on the rain-streaked windows. "We're almost there," Claire said, injecting her voice with an optimism she didn't feel. The words hung in the air like a fragile lie. The headlights illuminated the narrow tree-lined road ahead, the skeletal branches arching overhead like gnarled fingers. "This is it, guys," she added as the SUV creaked to a halt in the muddy driveway. The tires sank slightly into the sodden earth. The house loomed before them, its warped frame and broken shutters barely discernible through the torrential rain. The once white paint had faded into a mottled grey, streaked with dirt and neglect. Its sagging roofline gave the impression of a structure bowing under the weight of something unspeakable. The windows reflected nothing but the impenetrable darkness behind them, and for a fleeting moment, Claire thought she saw movement in one of them, a faint shift, a flicker of motion. She blinked, and it was gone. To the end of the row, Ethan tugged out one earbud and let out a low whistle. "Home sweet home, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Great choice, Mum." Claire ignored the jab, biting back a retort as she killed the engine. She stepped into the downpour, pulling her coat tight against the biting wind. This house, this dilapidated relic of her late husband's family, had seemed like a godsend when they were drowning in debt. But standing in its shadow now, the promise of a fresh start felt hollow. "It's what we've got," she said finally, popping the trunk and grabbing the first of their suitcases. "Let's just make the best of it." Ethan grumbled as he slammed his door shut. Emily hesitated before stepping out, her small frame trembling as she huddled under the hood of her raincoat. She clutched her rabbit tighter and stayed close to Claire as they trudged toward the house. The front door loomed ahead, the tarnished doorknob slick with rain. Claire hesitated as she twisted the key in the lock, the groan of the mechanism oddly loud against the storm. When the door finally swung open, it let out a shrill, almost pained creak that made Emily flinch. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness. Claire reached for the light switch, fumbling slightly, and was met with a single flickering bulb overhead. The dim light cast jagged, restless shadows along the cracked walls. Dust floated in the stagnant air, illuminated in the weak glow. The air was cold and carried the faint, unpleasant scent of mildew mixed with something metallic, something sharp and acrid that set Claire's teeth on edge. "God, this place is disgusting," Ethan muttered, kicking at a loose floorboard as he stepped inside. His voice was sharp with disdain, but Claire could hear the undercurrent of unease he was trying to mask. "Don't start," Claire snapped, her tone heavy with exhaustion. "We don't have a choice." "That's what you always say," Ethan shot back, before stomping up the creaking staircase, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty house. A door slammed somewhere above them, and the sound reverberated through the walls. Claire exhaled slowly and turned to Emily, who had yet to move from the doorway. The little girl's wide eyes were locked on the far end of the hallway, where a crooked mirror hung on the wall. Its surface was warped and dulled with age, but Emily seemed transfixed. Claire crouched down, gently placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Emily? Are you okay?" she asked softly. Emily blinked and looked at her mother, her grip on the rabbit tightening. "I don't like the shadows here, Mummy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're watching." "Hmm?" she said, glancing about. Claire felt her stomach knot. She pulled Emily close, kissing the top of her damp hair, "It's just a new place," she said, though her voice wavered. "It'll feel better once we settle in, I promise." Emily didn't respond. Her gaze shifted past Claire, lingering on something in the dim hallway behind her. The morning sunlight did little to dispel the oppressive weight that hung over the house. The storm had passed, leaving the farmhouse surrounded by a misty haze. But inside, the air remained heavy, and the faint scent of mildew, mixed with something more acrid, lingered like a warning. The family ventured into town for supplies. Claire hoped the change of scenery would lift the mood, but the small, dimly lit grocery store felt no more welcoming than the house. The shelves were half-stocked, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Claire noticed the way the locals watched her, their furtive glances darting away when she met their eyes. Now in the living room, she found a large number of people sitting at the tables. At the counter, the grocer, a wiry man with sunken cheeks, hesitated as he bagged their items. When Claire mentioned the farmhouse, his hands faltered. "Winslow Farm," he muttered. "Haven't heard anyone living there in decades." "We inherited it from my husband's side," Claire explained, forcing a smile. "It needs work, but it's home for now." The grocer's pale eyes scanned her face. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You might want to be careful out there," he said. "That land, it's seen things. Fires, deaths, things no one should talk about." What do you mean?" Claire asked, her stomach tightening. The grocer's gaze darted toward the door, his shoulders tensing as though someone might overhear. "Some say it's cursed. Others say it's worse than that. The old folks used to call it the seat of the false judge." "The what?" Claire pressed, but the man shook his head sharply. "Just be careful," he said, his tone final. On the drive back, Ethan leaned forward from the back seat. What was that guy's deal? False judge? Sounds like something from a bad horror movie. Claire gripped the wheel tightly. "It's just local superstition," she said, though the unease in her voice was hard to hide. "People love to make up stories about old places." In the rearview mirror, Emily's wide eyes stared out the window. Her small voice broke the silence. "I think the house likes stories." Claire stiffened, unsure how to respond. Ethan scoffed but said nothing more. The rest of the drive passed in tense quiet, punctuated only by the crunch of tires on gravel. That evening, the storm returned with renewed vengeance, wind howling as it battered the farmhouse. Rain lashed against the windows, and the old house groaned under the onslaught, as though protesting the intrusion of its new occupants. While Claire and Ethan tried to make the kitchen functional, Emily wandered upstairs. The rhythmic tapping she'd heard before was back, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. It seemed to call her, pulling her toward the far end of the upstairs hallway. She stopped in front of a small, partially hidden door she hadn't noticed before. A tattered curtain hung limply over it, swaying slightly in the draft. Emily hesitated, clutching her rabbit tightly, before reaching out and turning the knob. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow, steep staircase descending into darkness. The air here was colder, sharper, as though it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Emily's breath came in small, visible puffs as she took cautious steps downward. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a chamber carved from rough stone. Strange, jagged symbols covered the walls, their patterns twisting and intersecting like a language meant to repel understanding. The room's center was dominated by a blackened altar, its surface gleaming as though scorched by fire. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying the faint scent of sulfur that burned her nose. On the altar was a sigil, two wings twisted into a jagged crown. Below it, words carved deep into the stone read, "Regnum Sine Lege." Emily's small hand reached out, her fingers trembling as they traced the grooves of the sigil. She whispered the words aloud, her voice hollow and strange in the echoing chamber. The shadows in the room trembled, pulling toward her like smoke drawn into a flame. A low, guttural whisper rose from the air, too faint to understand but unmistakably there. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it became a cacophony of voices crying out at once. "Emily!" Claire's voice called from above, faint but urgent. The sound broke the spell. Emily stumbled back, her breath ragged, and fled up the stairs without looking back. She slammed the door shut behind her and pressed her back against it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stood there, the whispers faded, leaving only an unsettling silence. But she could still feel the cold weight of the altar in her mind, as if it had etched itself into her memory. The farmhouse seemed to exhale as the storm subsided. Rain continued to patter against the windows, but the oppressive howling wind had quieted, leaving only the eerie stillness of the house. Claire paced the living room, her fingers drumming nervously against the back of a chair. Something about the grocer's words, combined with Emily's unusual behavior, gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the image of her daughter's pale face after she'd come running upstairs, breathless and trembling. Emily hadn't said a word about what had scared her. When Claire pressed, the girl simply hugged her rabbit tighter and whispered, "It doesn't matter. He already knows." That night, the whispers returned. At first, they came faintly, curling through the walls like smoke, too soft to make out but impossible to ignore. Claire sat upright in bed, the book of demonology she had borrowed from the town's library resting on her lap. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and translations, and though she didn't fully understand what she was reading, the fragmented phrases, false judge, kingdom of disorder, bloodline bound, made her skin crawl. A soft creak came from the hallway outside her room, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's voice. Claire's heart clenched. "Emily?" she called out, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. She set the book aside and grabbed her phone, using the flashlight as she stepped into the dark corridor. The light from her phone flickered, as though something were interfering with the signal. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. Another creak came from the far end of the hallway. Claire turned the light toward it and froze. Emily stood motionless, her back to her mother, her small frame silhouetted by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window. "Emily," Claire said softly, stepping closer. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Emily didn't move, her head tilted slightly, her shoulders rising and falling, as though she were breathing heavily. "Emily, answer me," Claire insisted, her voice trembling. Suddenly, Emily's head snapped toward her with an unnatural speed, her wide, unblinking eyes catching the beam of light. "He's here," she whispered, her voice layered with something guttural, something not her own. Before Claire could react, the lights in the hallway surged and burst with a loud pop, plunging everything into darkness. Her phone's flashlight flickered wildly before shutting off completely. The hallway became an abyss. "Emily!" Claire screamed, scrambling for the light switch. Her hands fumbled against the wall, finding only the cold surface of the plaster. A moment later, the lights returned, dim and flickering. The hallway was empty. Downstairs, Ethan had his own encounter. He had stayed up late, scrolling aimlessly through his phone and trying to ignore the oppressive stillness of the house. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from the kitchen, an annoying but otherwise harmless noise he had gotten used to. He had just leaned back on the couch when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. The large cracked mirror in the corner of the room caught his attention. Something was wrong with his reflection. The dim light from the lamp cast long shadows, but the figure in the mirror didn't move when he did. It stood still, staring at him, its head slightly tilted, as if amused. "Great, I'm losing my mind now," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. The reflection's lips curled into a faint smile. Ethan froze, his blood turning cold. Slowly he turned to look behind him, expecting to see someone or something standing there. But the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection had returned to normal. But then the glass began to fog, as though something were breathing heavily against it from the other side. A single word appeared, written in the condensation: "Run." Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and hitting the floor with a loud thud. The noise startled Claire, who came running down the stairs. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to his side. Ethan pointed at the mirror, but the fog was gone. The glass was clear, showing nothing but their reflections. His voice shook as he muttered, "There was someone in the mirror. It wrote something." "Oh." Claire knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "Ethan, you're scaring me. What did it write?" "Run," he whispered. The next morning brought no reprieve. Though sunlight streamed through the warped windows of the farmhouse, it did little to dispel the darkness within. Shadows still seemed to cling to the corners of the rooms, and the oppressive chill in the air was worse than ever. Claire moved mechanically through her routine, making coffee and forcing herself to eat a piece of toast, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of Emily standing in the hallway, her voice carrying that impossible, layered tone. Nor could she forget Ethan's terror as he pointed to the mirror. "Run," he'd said. The word felt like a branding iron pressed into her thoughts, leaving her raw and scorched. "Mum?" Ethan's voice broke her reverie. He stood in the kitchen doorway, his face pale. "Emily's gone." The mug in Claire's hand slipped, shattering on the floor. "What do you mean? Gone? She was just upstairs." "She's not in her room. I've looked everywhere." Claire's heart pounded as she raced up the stairs, Ethan close behind. Emily's room was empty. Her bed was neatly made, her stuffed rabbit resting against the pillow. The only sign of her was the charcoal drawings covering the walls. Dozens of jagged, overlapping sigils that seemed to twist and shimmer when Claire stared at them too long. She wouldn't have left the house, Claire murmured, panic rising in her chest. She wouldn't just... A loud crash from downstairs cut her off. Both she and Ethan froze, their eyes meeting in shared fear. "That was the living room," Ethan whispered. He grabbed a fireplace poker as they cautiously made their way down the stairs. The sight that greeted them stopped Claire in her tracks. The large mirror in the corner of the living room had fallen to the floor, its glass shattered into thousands of jagged shards. In the middle of the destruction stood Emily, her bare feet surrounded by broken glass. She didn't seem to notice the sharp edges cutting into her skin. Her eyes were black as obsidian, her face expressionless. "Emily!" Claire gasped, stepping forward. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Emily tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, eerie smile. "He said you'd come," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but the words felt like knives. "Who?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Who said that?" Emily's smile widened, revealing teeth that looked sharper than they should. "The judge." Before anyone could react, the overhead light flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Claire reached out blindly, calling for Ethan, but her voice was drowned out by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. The shadows close in. Claire fumbled for her phone, its weak flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. She swept the light across the room, her breath hitching as she caught glimpses of movement. Shadows slithering along the walls like living things. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Where are you?" "There's always a choice." "I'm here." His voice came from her left, shaky but close. She turned the flashlight toward him, relief flooding her as she saw his figure crouched near the couch. But that relief was short-lived as she realized Emily was no longer standing in the center of the room. "Where is she?" Claire whispered, panic clawing at her throat. "Where's Emily?" The growl returned, louder this time, resonating through the floorboards. The sigils on the walls flared to life, their crimson glow casting eerie, shifting patterns across the room. Shadows erupted from the edges of the light, twisting into grotesque, half-formed shapes, with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. They moved with impossible speed, their forms flickering like dying flames. Ethan screamed as one of the figures lunged toward him, its skeletal hands outstretched. Claire grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it wildly, the glass shattering as it passed harmlessly through the shadow. The entity paused for a moment, its head tilting unnaturally, before vanishing into the air. "Get to the basement," a voice shouted from the doorway. Claire spun to see Father Gabriel and Dr. Hales standing there, both clutching relics that glowed faintly in their hands. Gabriel's face was grim, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the growls. "We have to get to the altar. It's the only way to stop this." "Emmeline's gone," Claire cried. "We can't leave her." "She's still here," Hales said, his voice urgent. "Belial has her, but he hasn't fully taken her yet. If we act now, we can save her." The group moved quickly, navigating the twisted corridors of the house as the shadows pursued them. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths visible as they descended into the basement. The narrow staircase seemed longer than Claire remembered, the stone walls pressing in on either side. At the bottom, the altar awaited, its surface gleaming as though freshly scorched. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy, the symbols on the walls glowing brightly. Emily stood in front of the altar, her small frame dwarfed by the oppressive atmosphere. She turned to face them as they entered, her black eyes reflecting the red light. "You're too late," she said, her voice echoing with a chorus of others. "He's already here." The ground beneath their feet trembled as a low, guttural roar filled the chamber. The shadows in the corners coalesced into a towering figure, its skeletal wings stretching impossibly wide. Belial's form was monstrous, his face flickering between beauty and horror, his molten eyes locking onto Claire. "Choose," the demon intoned, his voice vibrating through the air. "The boy or the girl. One will be mine." The farmhouse felt alive, pulsing with an oppressive energy that seemed to squeeze the breath from their lungs. The towering figure of Belial loomed over the altar, his skeletal wings stretching outward, the edges of his form flickering like a dying flame. His molten eyes bore into Claire, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "Choose," he intoned, his voice layered with guttural tones and a whisper that seemed to crawl under the skin. "The boy or the girl. One will scream for eternity, and the other will wish they had joined them." Claire staggered backward, her knees threatening to give out. The ground beneath her feet trembled, cracks forming in the stone floor and glowing faintly with an ominous red light. Ethan stepped forward, clutching the fireplace poker he'd grabbed from upstairs. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "You're not taking either of us," he said, glaring up at the monstrous figure. Belial's molten eyes shifted to him, his expression twisting into a grotesque parody of amusement. "Such bravery," the demon growled, the corners of his twisted mouth curling upward. "Do you think that piece of metal will protect you? Do you think you matter? I could unmake you with a thought." A shadowy tendril lashed out from the corner of the room, striking Ethan and flinging him across the chamber. He hit the wall with a sickening thud, crumpling to the ground. "Ethan!" Claire screamed, rushing toward him, but another tendril shot forward, wrapping around her ankle and dragging her back. She clawed at the floor, her fingers scraping against the rough stone, but the force was relentless. "You cannot save them," Belial hissed, stepping closer. His form flickered, shifting between monstrous and human. For a moment he bore the face of Claire's late husband, his voice soft but dripping with malice. "You couldn't save him. You couldn't save me. And you won't save them." "Hey?" Caspar asked, rising to his feet. "Claire!" Father Gabriel shouted, snapping her out of the demon's thrall. He stood near the altar, his crucifix held high, glowing faintly in the crimson light. "We can weaken him, but we need you." Dr. Hales stood beside the priest, frantically flipping through the ancient book of exorcisms. "Focus on the sigil," he yelled, pointing to the glowing symbol carved into the altar's surface. "That's his tether. We have to break it." Claire forced herself to her feet, her heart pounding. The shadowy tendril around her ankle tightened, burning her skin, but she pushed through the pain. She grabbed a nearby shard of broken glass and slashed at the tendril, which recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek. Staggering toward the altar, she locked eyes with Emily. The little girl stood motionless, her blackened eyes fixed on Claire. "He's in my head," Emily whispered, her voice laid with something alien and monstrous. "He says he'll make you choose who dies first." Claire knelt in front of her daughter, her hands trembling. "I'm going to get you back," she said, her voice cracking. "I promise." Emily's lips twitched into a faint smile. "He says your promises are dust, lies that break in the fire." Father Gabriel began the invocation, his voice strong and steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. "Sanctus Deus, omnipotens pater, libera hanc familiam a potestate tenebrarum." Sigils on the walls flared brighter, their crimson glow turning to an intense white. Belial roared, his skeletal wings spreading wide as the shadows around him writhed and twisted. "You cannot bind me!" he thundered, his voice resonating like a storm breaking over a desolate field. "I am freedom! I am chaos! I am what you hide from when the lights go out." The demon lashed out with his tendrils, striking at Gabriel and Hale. One tendril wrapped around Gabriel's arm, pulling him off balance and slamming him against the altar. The priest cried out, but held his ground, clutching the crucifix tightly as he resumed the prayer. The shadows around the room surged toward Belial, coalescing into his monstrous form as the light from the sigil consumed him. The demon's wings collapsed inward, his body disintegrating into a swirling mass of smoke and ash. With one final, deafening roar, he was pulled into the void, leaving only silence in his wake. Claire collapsed to the floor, her body trembling as the relic fell from her hand. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive energy dissipating like a receding storm. She looked up to see Emily lying motionless near the altar. Crawling toward her daughter, Claire pulled her into her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Sweetheart, please wake up." Emily's eyes fluttered open, their dark hue replaced with their natural color. She looked up at Claire, her voice faint. "Mummy?" Emily's face softened. She stopped, holding her daughter tightly. "I've got you. I've got you. I've got you." Ethan stumbled toward them, bruised but alive. He sank to the floor beside Claire, wrapping his arms around both of them. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're okay." Father Gabriel and Dr. Hale exchanged weary glances, their faces pale with exhaustion. "He's contained," Gabriel said quietly, "but this isn't over." Claire looked up, her expression grim. "What do you mean?" Hale sighed, closing the ancient book. "Belial isn't destroyed. He's bound. For now. But as long as the sigils exist, as long as there's pain and division, he'll always have a way back." Hale exhaled. The family left the farmhouse the next morning, the rising sun casting long shadows over the crumbling structure. As they drove away, Emily turned in her seat, her eyes lingering on the house growing smaller in the distance. "He's still there," she whispered. "He's waiting." Far away, in a bustling city, a man stumbled across a strange antique store tucked into a narrow alley. On a dusty shelf sat a small iron box, its surface engraved with a jagged crown surrounded by twisted wings. The man picked it up, his fingers tracing the sigil as a faint, guttural whisper filled the air. "A kingdom without law."